Have you ever thought about the difference between rock and ground? Like, why are they different types? They have a lot of the same themes and design conventions, but they count as different types. Or what about sound? Was sound really not a unique enough category, but we desperately needed water and ice to be separate? And what about dragon? Why isn't Charizard a dragon type? I've played Pokemon for a while, but I still have to ask myself, what do the types even mean? Okay, I'm being a little bit facetious with that question. Obviously, grass means grass, right? A grass Pokemon is a plant. A grass Pokemon has plants on it. A grass Pokemon at least has something to do with plants, right? So you can see where my confusion comes from, right? Like for some Pokemon, bug means butterfly, and for some it means crab. On paper, each type is simple, but each design interprets its type differently. So today, I'm gonna try to make sense of it all. I'm gonna actually figure out what each type actually means. Okay, so in my mind, there are a few different categories of types. Taxonomic traits, elemental powers, physical traits, and what I'm gonna call personality, for lack of a better name. Taxonomic types are ones like dragon, bug, and ghost. Pokemon of these types are exactly what it says on the tin. A dragon is gonna be a dragon, most of the time. Elemental types are pretty simple too. These are your fires, waters, and grasses. These Pokemon have control over their respective elements. Physical types describe the physical traits of a Pokemon. Steel and rock types are usually made of, well, steel and rock. Finally, personality types are kind of just whatever's left. Types like dark don't have many physical characteristics. Like specifically, dark is signified by evil and underhanded tactics, which is more of a behavioral characteristic than a visual one. If you look at this graph, you might notice a few types that overlap different categories. These are some of the more interesting cases, so let's start with them. Normal is a very interesting type thematically. It's kind of like the vanilla of Pokemon. A lot of it's just an animal Pokemon tend to be normal types. Weirdly though, normal also kind of acts as an other type. Normal is kind of just the bucket that they put things in when they don't fit anywhere else. And one of the things in that bucket is sound. Sound is kind of like a mini type. Pokemon like Whismur, Jigglypuff, Chatot, Audino, and Meloetta are all normal type just because they don't fit anywhere else and they're sound based. Fairy is another edge case. Being a relatively new type, even though X and Y came out 11 years ago, Fairy was introduced primarily as a check to dragons, and it shows. Fairy hasn't had as much time as the other types to establish what it even is. Seriously, there are so many different things that Fairy can represent. It could be describing literal fairies, it could be a personality thing, it could be describing just generally cute designs, it could even be an elemental thing with magic. But it even has its own semi-type with food. Recently, because everything about Fairy is recent, Pokemon that have been food-based will get Fairy. Why is Fido a fairy? Well, it isn't, it's just made of food. What about Alcremie? Same thing. Swirlix? We get the idea. Fairy's just such a strange type because it's had 11 years to get its act together and it just hasn't really. Poison is another really interesting case. It's kind of a mix between elemental and taxonomy. Poison is mainly talking about the literal poison that the Pokemon controls, but it also gets added to a lot of poisonous and venomous animals, so it's kind of 50-50. Also, poison types have recently been more associated with like pollution and smog, so maybe it's more like 50-30-20. The elemental types are the easiest to describe, so let's start with fire. Fire, to no one's surprise, represents fire. This is pretty easy to see in pretty much any fire type starter design. Almost all of them physically have fire on their bodies. The only ones that don't are Delphox and Cinderace, and even then, Delphox's wand, staff thing has fire on it, and Cinderace's Pyro Ball is made of fire. So the main thing with fire types is that they control fire, obviously. Water is a little more interesting though. There is the elemental aspect, I mean most water types can control water, but there's also a habitat aspect to water types that not a ton of other types get. A lot of water types are some sort of fish or sea creature that are water types purely because they just live in the water. Almost every water type that doesn't explicitly control water is some sort of aquatic animal. Grass is the most varied of the three starter types. Grass designs can range from animals with plants on them, literal plants, things that live in grassy areas, things made from plants like paper or tea, or just nature as a whole. The first few are pretty easy to explain, but the nature connection is a little more interesting. Pokemon like Tapu Bulu have more to do with how they control and balance nature than any plants in the design, and I think that's really interesting. Electric is the most simple type. Most electric Pokemon are just creatures that happen to be able to control electricity. I feel like electric suffers the most from just being tacked on to normal animals. Like, what if mouse, but electricity? What if dog, but electricity? What if eel, but actually that wouldn't make sense. It's so rare to see an electric type be built from the ground up around its concept being electricity. And that doesn't mean electric is bad. I love Luxray as much as the next guy. It just means it's not as varied in its theming as other types. Ice has the same habitat idea as water. On top of being able to control ice and cold, tons of ice types are just creatures that live in icy areas in real life. Creatures that are specially adapted to live in the cold are way more likely to be ice type. Like Mamoswine doesn't control ice, and it's not made of it, but the design is so themed around the cold that it would kind of feel out of place for it not to be ice type. Ice is also kind of a physical type too. Some ice types are just entirely made out of snow or ice. Like Glalie is made out of ice, the Darmanitan line and Galar is made out of snow, and Vanillish gets to be both. Flying is one of the most interesting types because it overlaps with elemental and taxonomic categories. Like one of the main things that flying represents is creatures that are birds, or like bird adjacent? Basically just things that have wings. This is kind of interesting because something doesn't actually have to be able to fly to be categorized in this way. Something could be flying type and incapable of flying. Flying's other main trait is elemental. Flying type can represent things that have control over the air and wind. But my favorite way that flying manifests is in the name. I love it when the only reason that something is flying is just that it is flying. Like Gyarados. If you tell me that Gyarados has anything to do with the sky other than the fact that it's in it, you're lying. Flying's also a pretty good transition into the taxonomy types. So let's start with Bug. Bug is very simple. Almost every bug Pokemon is just a straight up bug. And why wouldn't they be? Like, what reason would something have to be bug type and not literally a bug? A lot of other types have things that they can represent that aren't literally their type, but bug doesn't really have that, and that's kind of interesting to me. The same mostly goes for dragons. There's a little more room for differences in designs with dragons because they're not real. Dragon types are based on dragons from a lot of different cultures, so there's a lot of design space for creativity. But a lot of reptilian creatures also get the dragon type. Designs like Cyclizar aren't literally dragons, but they're reptilian enough that they're like, close enough. Another way dragon manifests is the idea of like draconic energy or power. Regidrago and Zygarde are pretty good examples of this. Like, I don't think any sane person would call either of these two literal dragons, but their power is easiest to get across with dragon type. That also has the side effect of implying that Alolan Exeggutor is just so powerful that no other type captures that raw strength, which is so funny that I'm counting it anyway. Ghost is another taxonomic type with a little more room for creativity. I already talked about ghosts in our own video, but this is the short version. Ghosts are often literal ghosts, that's why they're a taxonomy type, but they can also represent things that have a control over spirits, have a connection to the afterlife, or just give off spooky vibes. Next, let's talk about the personality types, starting with Dark. Dark is generally used as a kind of like evil type. Pokemon that are scary, use underhanded tactics, or are just kind of mean often get Dark type. Dark also kind of represents the idea of literal darkness. This mainly manifests with nocturnal designs, or ones that use darkness as a power. Fighting is another personality type. Fighting types are usually represented by the act of fighting. Fighting also usually manifests more with behavioral and personality attributes than physical ones. Designs that are more aggressive or skilled at battling are usually fighting types. Psychic was the hardest type for me to categorize. It describes the act of being psychic, which could mean a lot of different things. It could be the use of psychic powers as an element, but psychic types are also usually characterized as being more intelligent, so I settled on personality. A lot like fighting a dark type, Psychic doesn't really have any physical traits other than being purple. Psychic is also a kind of other bucket, like normal. These are your Sigilifts, Unknowns, and Wobbuffets. If a design is too weird even to be a normal type, then it's gonna be Psychic. or if it's from space for whatever reason. Now let's talk about steel. If a Pokemon is made out of steel, it's gonna be steel type. Steel also represents Pokemon with any metal or hard material on their bodies. Like Aggron isn't specifically made out of steel, but it's pretty clearly supposed to be some sort of metal. Steel also represents sharpness. Like Kartana is very explicitly not made of any metal, but steel gets across the idea of how sharp it is better than any other type. The same goes to Mawile. Like very clearly no part of this thing is actually made of metal, but steel gets across how sharp its teeth are. Rock and ground are extremely similar, but I think I found something that sets them apart. Rock has more in common with physical types, and ground has more in common with elemental. Rock types are characterized mostly just by being made out of rocky or hard materials. And ground types are characterized more by controlling the earth. Ground type is also more of a habitat type. Designs that live in the earth are often ground. Like Excadrill isn't made out of earth. It's ground type because it digs in the ground. Designs that have to do with controlling the earth, like Groudon and Zygarde, make way more sense to be ground than rock. So basically, rock types are earth, and ground types live in and control it. But the fact that types are categorized this way can cause some problems. That's right, we're talking about Charizard. The problem with Charizard is that it is so clearly a dragon, but isn't dragon type. Charizard is one of the most popular examples of a Pokemon being mistyped. To be fair, Dragon does make a lot of sense for Charizard, but Flying arguably makes more sense. Charizard is a dragon, don't get me wrong, I'm not about to start going crazy, but you can make the argument that its wings are a bigger part of its design. That's the issue with splitting types between elemental and anatomy. Like, Charizard isn't the only case of it either. Flygon should be bug, Pheasantipede could be flying, Lugia should be water, Florges definitely should be grass, Psyduck should be psychic type. Since there are only 2 slots and typing is so subjective, the 3 type scenarios are really common. So why does this actually happen? Well, I think it's the way that types are categorized. The fact that types can be either anatomical or elemental can cause a lot of triple type situations. Most mistypings are caused by an anatomical type. As long as a Pokemon could feasibly be a bird, dragon, or bug, but isn't, then they could be a different type. It's really rare to see an elemental type be missing from a Pokemon. Like, you will never see a Pokemon that could be electric, but isn't. And that's because electric types and elemental types as a whole are usually central to the design of a Pokemon. Anatomical types usually aren't though. If a Pokemon has 2 elements that fit, but is also a bird, 9 times out of 10, Game Freak is gonna make it the 2 elemental types. And that's fine, that's just the way that they prioritize typing. If anything, it makes more sense to put more emphasis on the thing that makes a Pokemon different from a normal animal. It just presents situations where people can disagree. And that's kind of weird, right? Like, any other system wouldn't have subjective cases. It's kind of strange that what someone prioritizes in a design is a factor at all, no? But I think that's kind of what makes Pokemon types unique. The fact that they're not all describing variations on one feature, but different facets of many different things is kind of cool. So I think that's what every Pokemon type means.